Good evening and welcome to Seminary Live, Seminary Now Live. I'm your host, Gene Wilkes, and some of you may know, Seminary Now is a live streaming platform that brings you Bible, theology, and ministry guidance through a variety of exceptional leaders, professors, and authors. And tonight we have a special guest with us, Dr. Scott Floyd. And what we are about tonight is entering a dialogue with Dr. Floyd on uh, his particular class on crisis counseling that he did for us at Seminary Now. Dr. Floyd is a professor of psychology and counseling and director of our B.H. Carroll's Masters of Arts in Counseling. He is a licensed professional counselor and an LPC supervisor, and also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And we have the privilege of being colleagues at B.H. Carroll Theological Institute in Irving, Texas, where I am president and professor of New Testament and leadership. So I am privileged to be here with a colleague, be part of the Seminary Now live event, and welcoming Dr. Floyd. Scott, good to have you tonight.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and I do appreciate Seminary Now for making this type of content available to ministry personnel, and I'm grateful that we've gotten to partner with them at BH Carroll. And so it's good to be here this evening.
You know, one of the things I like about Seminary Now is they have partnered with seminaries like Northern and uh, different ministry groups to provide this content. I think theological training is so important, and that's why we at BH Carroll Theological Institute feel like one of our responsibilities is to equip men and women called to serve Christ in the diverse and global ministries of His church. And partnerships like with Seminary Now help us do that. You may want to check out BH Carroll. It's bhcarroll.edu. And we are a theological graduate school for clergy, counselors, chaplains, and we have PhD and DMin accredited degrees with ATS and ABHE. And we'd love to partner with you in your journey to be equipped to fulfill the calling that God has on your life. And again, as Scott said too, we are so grateful to be part of the Seminary Now family. Now, as we get started, we want you to know that we've got some prizes for you. One of those is a one-year subscription to Seminary Now. And here's how you do this. You simply share this live stream on Facebook, and we'll draw a winner, and you can share up to 24 hours after the event to be counted in the drawing. So after this is done and it's published, you can put that up on Facebook, and you'll be drawn, and you'll get a one-year subscription to Seminary Now. Or second, you can sign up to view Scott's course and many more at Seminary Now with a 7-day free trial. So just as you go along and you like what you hear and have others that are participating, then we want you to get some things back in return. Also, know too that you can post your questions for Scott as we go along and cover the content in the chat box anytime during the event. And if you have a comment to tell us where you're connecting from, go ahead and test that out right now. Let us know where you are and how you're listening. So as we get started, we want to introduce Scott's course to you if you're not familiar with it. And here is a 2-minute trailer video for Scott's Seminary Now course on crisis counseling.
Following tragic events, churches will often do the best they know how to do. They'll provide for some of the physical needs, but don't really know what to do beyond that. They often don't know how to address some of the more extensive emotional needs that may be present after a tragic event. Often people won't feel confident in what to say or what to do, and so they may not do anything. This course is designed to help you know some of the basic things to say and some of the basic things to do to try to provide help in the best way for those that are hurting. All of the things we'll talk about in this course have examples that show up in Scripture. By looking at Scripture and paying attention, we can draw from those things we see that help us today. My name is Dr. Scott Floyd, and I am a licensed counselor and counseling professor who has worked for many years training individuals to serve as professional counselors in churches, counseling centers, and community agencies. In this course, we will consider how ministers and counselors can work with individuals who experience a crisis or traumatic event. How can we best provide comfort, care, and healing to those who are hurting? It is my prayer that God will use this course to better equip you in the healing work that He has given you to do.
Scott, I was a pastor 26 years before coming to B.H. Carroll, and I wish I'd had a course like this because it seems like in ministry there are always crises, traumatic events, loss, and grief. And so tell us a little bit of what you're seeing in churches and why you think such a course and this kind of training is necessary.
And I think that's exactly right, Gene. I think no matter what position you might have in the church, and whether it's a paid position or a volunteer lay position, it's not long before you run up against a person in crisis or a person who's experienced a traumatic event. And so having some knowledge of what to do, how to help those people can be hugely beneficial. Conversely, not knowing what to do leaves you scrambling, leaves you reacting, leaves you guessing. And there are times that can result in not just not helping, but even perhaps harming a person that's already struggling. And so there are some really basic things that every minister can learn that will help them to be better when they run across folks that are experiencing difficult events ranging from mild to as extreme as they can be.
Right. Well, I appreciate that you did some definitions for me, because I think sometimes we use words like crisis and trauma, loss kind of as synonyms. And that's can be misguiding, misleading, I think, and also confusing, maybe as we try to help them. One of the things that you did in the course was you may define some of these things. So maybe give us some foundations for what is a crisis and how's it different from trauma and loss and grief.
Okay, and I do think the definitions are important, and in the course we do define them and talk about biblical examples of each of these, and the Bible really does have a lot to say about it. I think a crisis is a turning point where something can go either direction. It can go an okay direction or it can go a bad direction. Right. With crisis, the person's perception of the event tends to cause distress, and it can challenge coping. And so crises can range from mild things. Your car battery is dead when you go out to start your car, to something devastating. We just had 10 inches of rain here in the Metroplex in Dallas-Fort Worth yesterday, and we're watching people that had 2 feet of water in their houses, and they're experiencing a pretty tough crisis today. And so they can range from mild to extreme. The teenagers, almost anything can be a crisis. The stain on your shirt, your hair doesn't work out that day. And so those can be seen as crises, and a lot of it does have to do with the person and their perception or their sense. Trauma is a little bit different. Trauma, the basic word means wound. I think there are 4 elements to trauma, and my definition kind of has made up of those 4 parts. Trauma, there's an actual event. There's something that happens, like a tornado hits your house, or where this is the anniversary of Hurricane Harvey in the Houston area. And we're right at the anniversary of when that happened a few years ago. There's an actual event that takes place. the event is not a normal part of coping. And so when we have trauma events, people don't tend to wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to be in a bad car wreck today, or later today, a fire is going to destroy my house. Or those going to the World Trade Center towers on 9/11 weren't on their way to work thinking a plane is really likely to crash into the building this morning. It's not part of what we envision happening. We really don't have a framework in our brain for making sense out of it when it happens. So it's not a part of normal human experience. When a traumatic event happens, it tends to overwhelm coping, and trauma almost always produces symptoms. Symptoms can be mild, or symptoms can be extreme and ongoing, and PTSD would come out of that. We hear people talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, and you have to have a certain set of symptoms for a certain length of time for that to happen. But many people who experience traumatic events can experience at a certain point PTSD. And I do think there's a difference between crisis and grief. Between crisis and trauma. Trauma is an actual event. There's something that takes place. Crisis can be perception only. If a person thinks they're going to be fired from their job, that can produce a type of crisis, and perhaps their boss is in no way thinking of firing them, but the person can have all the emotional impact of a crisis, even if it's not going to happen. So crisis can be perception. Crisis can have a gradual onset. Uh, Something that happens slowly, like an illness developing over time, or aging can even result in crisis, but it can have a gradual onset. Trauma almost always happens suddenly, where there's a kind of a blow from outside that you didn't see coming. A crisis can be resolved quickly, and that's another difference between it and trauma. One that you and I have talked about before is if you have your child or grandchild with you in the store, and your 3-year-old child or grandchild all of a sudden is missing and you can't find them, you can have 45 seconds or 2 minutes of panic, of terror.
Right.
But when you find them, it's over and it resolves quickly. And so crisis can resolve quickly. Trauma doesn't tend to resolve quickly. It tends to linger, and it tends to activate a person's central nervous system in a way that it takes a while to come off of it. And some people have a really hard time deactivating after an event like that with trauma. But crisis can actually start quickly, start slowly, it can end quickly. Both crisis and trauma can produce symptoms. Crisis may not produce symptoms. Trauma almost always produces symptoms, and whether they're mild or extremely, extremely powerful, trauma almost always produces symptoms in these individuals. So those definitions are important, and there's a difference between crisis and trauma.
Yeah, a couple of questions follow up. One is, in your courses, you talk about biblical examples. Do you have some biblical examples of trauma? Because what we're talking about has been around for a long time.
Right. Two of the ones that are really, really clear to me in Scripture that would be examples of trauma. One is when the Israelites are in captivity and the 10 plagues happen, the last plague where the firstborn from every Egyptian household is killed. That's trauma to Egyptian nation really on a national level. That's extensive. Like war in Ukraine might be a parallel to something like that that's on a national level trauma. But when you see the Israelites say to the Egyptians, "Hey, we're leaving now, and give us all your best stuff," and the Egyptians give them their best stuff, and the Israelites leave. That makes sense in a trauma framework, in that kind of stunned aftermath or trauma fog that I call it. Sometimes you get that people doing things that don't make a lot of sense, and when the trauma fog lifts, they go chasing after them. They're losing their slaves and all their best stuff. But I think that's a really good example of trauma on a national scale. Job, to me, is an example, and we talk about with trauma, type 1 trauma, which would be single event, single blow trauma, and type 2 trauma, which is repeated event trauma. There's more than one event, and Job loses kind of in succession everything that belongs to him, his livelihood, then his children all die, his health is compromised. And so Job would be an example of type 2 trauma. And if you read the book of Job, you see him responding, even in wondering if he wants to live anymore, ways that are really typical of folks after a traumatic event. And Job is a really good example of type 2 trauma.
Mm-hmm. That kind of leads to the second question for me as a pastor and a professor. Trauma sounds like you said, it takes a while to walk through it.
Mm-hmm.
Healing isn't, resolution isn't as quick as maybe in a crisis. So what would you tell someone like me who's in ministry and someone comes to us with a traumatic experience, and I'm not trained to walk them through that? What are some things? I remember you saying in one of your classes about how ministers can
Right.
respond to these kind of things. Give us some of those examples.
Right.
Not all of us here are counselors on this.
No, but there are some basic things you can do and some basic things you shouldn't do. Letting the person talk, and after trauma, you do have some people that are kind of shut down and won't talk, but you have people who will talk about it and talk over and over and over again, and they're trying to make some sense out of what happened. And so they'll often tell the story over and over and over again. And so allowing them to talk and allowing them to process through. Normalizing. Sometimes, in fact, not just sometimes, really commonly, after trauma, people will feel like they're going crazy. And if you ask them, do you feel like you're going crazy? They'll often say yes. And so a lot of what we do is let them know that the impact of what's happening, what's going on in their mind and in their body. It's how God designed your mind and body to deal with something really, really difficult, and it's doing what it does. And so letting them know that it's not unusual. One of the things that I really encourage ministry people to do is avoid simplistic kind of answers and avoid even kind of shallow theology at this point. We actually have a biblical example of that when Job's struggling. And his friends for the first week actually do a really good counseling job. They sit with him and they're silent. They don't say anything. They sit with him in his grief, in his struggle. And I think they're actually good counselors for the first week. But after the first week, they open their mouth and try to tell Job why this happened and what he needs to do. And things go really, really badly after that. And so avoiding simple kind of answers, or here's what God wants you to know through this, or here are the things you want to do. And oftentimes after trauma, people will have difficulty with basic religious kinds of experience. They'll have trouble coming to church. They'll have trouble singing hymns. They'll have trouble opening their Bible. They'll have trouble praying. And being really, really patient with them, especially if it's a more impactful trauma event where there was loss of life or threatened loss of life. You get people that can really be shut down spiritually at times. And being really patient with that would be important.
Yeah, in other words, when they do get to that, like, how can God be a good God if he let this happen? Or where was God in the midst of all this? You're telling us don't try to explain theologically, but listen.
Yeah, and what I do, especially right after a trauma event, and those kind of questions would be really, really, really common. Mm-hmm. And what I tend to say is, I don't have an easy answer, but I can tell this hurts a lot, and let me sit with you and let's hang out together as you go through this. Yeah. If I'm working with them over a period of time, well into our relationship, when things are more stabilized, we may wrestle with those things theologically.
Right.
But early on, there is no combination of words I can say that's going to take away the struggle or the pain at that point. I can let them know I'm sorry. I can let them know I love them, but I can't string together words in a way that takes away the pain or the confusion or the blow of the trauma. So I don't even try to do it at that point.
I remember in your lessons, you quoted Psalm 77, 7 through 9. And that's why I love the Psalms. One commentator said, in the Psalms, we get to say to God that we wouldn't say on our own.
Yeah.
Those questions about, is your everlasting love ever going to come, or something like that? They asked, that passage just struck me as, we've been asking these all along. And
Right, right. You find a couple of parallels of those in the book of Job, where Job is asking questions of that nature. But the reason I like that passage is it's a series of about 5 or 6 questions in a row of that nature. Where
yeah,
are you, God? Have you forgotten about me? Are you going to let me struggle with this forever? Do you not care about me anymore? And they're of that essence. And those are the types of things that people, especially people of faith, will struggle with when they come to us after a traumatic event. And so, one of the fascinating things to me is that was the Israelite hymn book. And corporately, they sang those things together, which I think allowed them to sort of grieve and struggle corporately and to do it in such a way. And so, if individuals have those kind of questions, as opposed to trying to shut the questions down or provide simplistic answers, I think we can actually allow them to ask the questions they have and give them a place to ask the questions and let the questions be there. And we don't have, interestingly to me, in the book of Job, Job has those questions. God never answers them at the end when he shows up.
yeah,
And he never provides him with an answer to the questions that Job has.
right.
But he does show up and I think comfort Job and assure Job of his love for him.
Yeah. A lot of this is in your book. Remind us again, the title of your book and who published it.
Yeah, the book was and the series for Seminary Now was based on the book, and the book is Crisis Counseling: A Guide for Pastors and Professionals, and it was published by Kriegel Publishing, and so it is available. You can find it on Amazon or places like that, and it's really aimed at the minister that doesn't have a lot of training in this area or the beginning counseling. And so it's aimed at sort of that level. If this isn't something you have extensive training in, that's who I wrote the book for.
Well, and I remember you saying one other thing about when a minister isn't prepared. You talk about referrals. Tell us a little bit about what a community of caring counselors, professional counselors, as well as the community of the church, et cetera. Tell us how that helps, again, ministers like me who are not professionally trained, but know that this is something that I will be a prayer partner. I will sit with you, but I know there's more to working through this than what I know to do. What would I do then? It's related to referrals.
I think one of the best things that a minister can do is in their community, before you get to crisis and trauma, is be aware of who's in your community in counseling or helping professions. Who is trained in trauma and approaches things from a trauma informed perspective, who has experience in doing trauma counseling. And perhaps even beyond that, is there someone that's really good with teenagers? Is there someone who's really good with children? Is there someone who's really good with married couples? Who's good with college age students? If we run across a college age student, or if there's some kind of crisis or disaster in our community and it impacts the local college or university, or if it happens in our church ministry, when ministers become aware of who's around them, they form relationships ahead of time. It really reduces the likelihood that you're reactive or that you have to scramble and try to find someone, or you just cross your fingers and hope someone's okay. You develop those relationships, and I one of the things I try to facilitate, but I wish there were a lot more of, is open channels between counselors and ministers and open lines of communication when these things take place, and to support each other and to support each other in working with individuals from the church, from the community, if things of this nature happen.
Right, right. That was so crucial when I was in ministry to have uh, a, uh, what we have then Rolodexes with the names of
Right.
uh, counselors that I could refer to. You mentioned children and adolescents. I'm familiar, just having been around some counselors, that sometimes counsel with children use what I watched is play therapy or in a sandbox and that kind of thing. So, how do you deal differently with children and adolescents? What's some suggestions you'd have if we have children who've experienced, divorce in their family, death in their family, grief, loss? What are some suggestions related to caring for children and adolescents?
In essence, right. And I do think those that work with children and adolescents are really important if something happens, because there are some similarities in how adults and children or adults and adolescents experience traumatic events, but there are some differences. Children's thinking, especially younger children, is still pretty magical, and they have a lot of gaps. Children, for instance, can't gauge time and distance well. And so, if you have a child in the central US and we have something like World Trade Center happens and it's on the news, the child can't gauge how far away that is. And so, where an adult can kind of reason that happened a long way away from me, a child can't necessarily do that. It can feel closer and it can feel more dangerous. And so, being aware that for children, things of that nature can happen. After a traumatic event, children often can struggle, and you can see it in their behavior. You can see it in school performance. You may even see regression where a child wants to be held, or a child sucks their thumb, and they haven't done that in a few years, and so you can see things of that nature happen. Um, for parents and for Sunday school teachers, for school teachers, for um, uh, religious leaders, ministers, consistency, uh, predictability, those things become really important for children after. And so, trying to, if a family has had something tough happen, if the family can have some predictability or communicate to the child what's going to happen, that can help a lot. Um, Being aware that if a child goes through a traumatic event, that things like being separated from parents, it becomes hard, and where it may not have been in the past. So being dropped off at school, being dropped off at Sunday school, or bedtime can be really difficult times because you're going to be separated, and all the fears and anxiousness can come out at those times. So being really patient if that's going on, and realizing that there's individual difference. You can have two children from the same family go through the exact same trauma event, and one doesn't have much impact and the other has extensive impact.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, um, if it seems to be staying in place with a child, uh, knowledge of if there is a counselor that has some specialization in this, it may be a route to go.
Yeah.
Um,
And
with
you said earlier, adolescents have crises every day. So I don't
Yeah,
know
with
if there's
adolescents,
any help there.
and adolescents, their development and their cognitive abilities are quite different. But adolescents still make a lot of errors in their cognitive processes, and their brains really are developing a lot, starting about 12 or 13, and for the next several years. And so you get sort of developmental processes and identity development and the traumatic events sort of all thrown in together. And uh, and so an adolescent can, an adolescent often impacted by brain development, they can misread situations, even not in traumatic events. And so a teacher is not in the best mood, and the adolescent concludes that teacher hates me. And so they can come to conclusions that really don't fit what's taking place. And you can see how that would be exacerbated with trauma. Adolescents, if something happens within their circle, like if a kid in their school is killed, adolescents will often locate themselves closer to the trauma event. Um, uh, and you'll hear things like, well, that was my best friend. And it may have been a person they had a couple of classes with a couple of years ago,
Right.
but they'll locate themselves often closer. And probably a part of that is trying in their own minds to justify how stirred up they feel inside.
Mhm.
And how kind of off balance emotionally they feel. And so being aware of that and being aware that adolescents can be impacted pretty strongly.
Okay, good. One thing back to your book, one of the participants asked, is it in Spanish? Has it been translated?
It has been translated into Korean, and there was a version in India. I do not believe, to my knowledge, it's been translated into Spanish.
Okay, well, we need to get to the publisher then.
And see if they'll translate it right, yes.
Another question was about conversation starters as you walk through this. And let me kind of tee this up I'm a volunteer police and fire chaplain in my city, you know that. And one of the things we are trained in is CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management. And you gave us 5 steps of how you deal with that. And it's often for first responders, they walk right up on very horrific events. And
Right.
but I think those questions or those steps, and those questions could be conversation starters for ministers. So could you walk through those? One, would you agree that's a nice pattern? I don't want to put anything in your mouth that's not true, but those seem to be very helpful to me when I was
right. The CISM framework was developed by first responders for first responders, and I think there are a lot of things of value that it had. I use a variation of their framework when I do counseling with individuals or if I meet with larger groups in a debriefing. And the framework is basically facts, thoughts, feelings, symptoms, resources. And so I start out with facts and ask the person if they could just walk me through what happened. And usually my first question is, what were you doing before you knew something was wrong? Can you tell me what you're doing? And I'm just, facts is, and I'm thinking the CISM framework, and I actually agree with this, it's the safest thing for someone to tell you. And so they can walk you through the kind of here's what happened, the facts. Then I ask them, do you remember what you were thinking while this was taking place, before and during and after? And so we go through thoughts. Thoughts is a little bit harder for them to tell you. It's sometimes it's riskier in some ways, but generally, if you've done this and you've smoothly gone through the facts, then they'll tell you thoughts. Then I ask them, I'll ask them, do you remember anything that you were feeling? Do you remember any of your emotions while it was happening, after the event happened? That's the toughest one for people to tell you. And the thing you have to be aware of as a minister or a counselor is if you ask that, people will tell you tough things. They'll tell you tough things they were thinking. It could be something like, where was God? Was God not paying attention? Did God not care? Their emotions, they can tell you things that are really hard. I will usually ask them when we get to that facts, thoughts, feelings, the third part of that, what's been the toughest part of this for you? And that's where you're kind of getting to where some of the wound actually is. And people will tell you, again, if you ask them, really, really hard things at times. So you have to be pretty tough to be able to withstand them telling you that. In my framework, I then talk with them about symptoms. And we deal with symptoms. I actually, in the back of my book, have a symptom checklist, and it has cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms, relational symptoms, and spiritual symptoms. And it has right after the event happened and between the event and now. What ones did you experience? And we go over those together and we talk about those and try to figure them out. Symptoms are really important. Some people will have really strong symptoms right away. Some people's symptoms won't appear for a period of time. I was involved extensively in providing counseling for the staff and for individuals that were in the Wedgwood church shooting in the late 1990s. That was sort of my start in the crisis field. And I was on scene the night that happened. I went to the church and actually got across the police barricades, and I was at the church that night. And then colleagues and myself worked with the church staff and with individuals who were in the auditorium when that church shooting happened, and we worked with them over several months, including a lot of the teenagers that were in the service where the shooting happened and the deaths took place. Interestingly, the people that were in the auditorium, to me, were less symptomatic than people who are on the grounds but not in the auditorium. And initially, and it really caught me off guard. Why are the people who saw the shooting happen less symptomatic? But we had a really strange thing happen about 3 months after the Wedgwood church shooting. We got all kind of calls for counseling, and they were very similar. The calls were, I thought I was doing okay, but I just started, and fill in the blank. I just started having nightmares. I just started afraid to go to work. I just started carrying a baseball bat with me when I go walking in the neighborhood, and people would say, I feel like I'm going crazy. I thought I was doing okay. Mm-hmm. And I really think what happened was that those that were in the auditorium were so emotionally impacted that the only parallel that I can think of is being in the cold, where you come out of the cold and your hands don't start hurting until you warm up. Yeah. And your hands are frozen, they don't hurt. It's when you start warming up. And as these folks got 3 to 6 months away from the Wedgwood church shooting and they were safer, they felt safer, the symptoms emerged. And so knowing what you're looking for, knowing sort of directions of symptoms, being able to assure people that symptoms are not surprising. I will tell folks, this is how God made your body and mind. And when you go through something horrific like you've been through, your body and mind is basically saying, I can't make sense out of this. Right. And so what it does, it produces symptoms, and they're different for different people, and they show up at different times for different individuals. And so we do a lot of that. Part of that's to normalize whatever their symptoms are and help them understand, and they get a read on which symptoms we're going to be focusing on the days ahead. And then the last thing I do is resources. There are times a person may tell you, for instance, that I'm having chest tightness and I'm having a little bit of trouble breathing, and you need to direct them to their personal physician. And so resources of that nature. There are times where people will need ongoing counseling. And so if you're not a counselor, you do want to help them find that and find a place to do that. If you are a counselor, you're just arranging for them to see you over a period of time. A lot of times, if the crisis was house fire, all my belongings destroyed, then resources may be things like what you can connect with to replace lost clothes, lost household furnishings, things of that nature. And so resources. And so that's kind of and that comes from that CISM framework that I find really, really doable and really useful. And it's sort of graduated from safest to the hardest, and then coming back up and connecting a person with what they need to follow up.
Very good. Very good. Those have given us some good questions to ask along the way. So as a minister, chaplain, counselor, you're carrying a bunch of stuff, emotional, and emotional weight, I think, is as heavy as any as there are. But so, how do I take care of myself? how,
Okay.
how, any suggestions for self care for a caregiver? How do we keep from falling down under the weight of all of this?
Okay, yeah, and it's really important for ministers, for counselors. Actually, in our training, we go through things that have to do with self care and things of that nature. Ministers may not go through that quite as much, but boy, really vulnerable to burnout and to even some things like secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma is when you can actually be traumatized by hearing someone else's trauma story.
Uh,
And just the nature of their story can actually traumatize you. And so recognizing that. And so there are some things I think if you're dealing with a really, really tough situation, you have to work to keep your emotional balance. And the best metaphor, and this is not my metaphor, but I think it fits the very best, is the airplane oxygen mask. And when you're on the airplane, the instructions are if the oxygen masks drop, you put yours on first before you put those on anybody else around you, including children. And as a parent, that is so counterintuitive. You want to get those oxygen masks on kids, but if you start becoming woozy or cognitively compromised, you may lose effectiveness and not be able to get masks on and harm everybody. And so there really is a parallel, I think, to the help and field for ministers and counselors. If you're not taking care of yourself, you're going to lose effectiveness. And if you lose enough effectiveness, you may harm yourself or harm someone else. And so I do think you have to take care of yourself spiritually. I think you have to take care of yourself physically. When I've dealt with large scale traumas, Wedgwood church shooting or other big events like that, they're exhausting. And your temptation is to not eat well, not hydrate, not exercise, but you have to keep those things going to keep yourself in shape. And spiritually, you're really, really busy. And so you may neglect things like your own devotional time. And I think you have to keep those types of things in place. I do think spiritually, you have to stay oriented. You are a helper, but you are not God. You are not
good word.
responsible for all the help to everyone around you. You're not a Messiah. And if you function like that, you're going to burn out really, really, really quickly. And so, in some respects, you have to decide what you can do and be willing to do that much and see if you can get others to help also. Because if you try to do everything yourself, you're going to crash and burn, and it's going to be pretty easy to do that. And so you do have to take care of yourself. You do have to, and counselors, we actually teach them to try to deal with the hard parts when you can problem solve. But when you come home, for instance, to make the shift and to be home and be present with your wife, be present with your husband, be present with your kids, to be there and to let go of the other stuff that you can't fix by worrying about it constantly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
good. Good word. Very good word. Let me turn to a question from the comments of participants. Jim wanted to know, what do you think of, and I'm going to read the acronym. I don't know what this means, but I'll let you. What do you think of NCTSN psychological first aid as a training tool?
Um, and I'm not sure exactly what that's referring to. Jim, I can't see everybody on my screen. If you want to type that out, I can see if I recognize that.
Um, so I think one of the things that was encouraging to me too through this was the biblical examples of both caring for and events that happen, and then how God used those. Did any of your favorites, you mentioned Job and the Israelites, and any New Testament uh, incidents where someone, in other words, as we're reading through the Bible, we could identify, okay, this was a serious loss, or this was a serious uh, crises, traumatic event, and then how did that character respond? Because I really appreciate that about what you put in your classes that had to, you always had some biblical references.
Yeah,
Any particular ones come to mind?
sure. Uh, Mentioning maybe just a couple, I think of the New Testament really clear example of trauma is the crucifixion. And you have a party like the Passover, the holiday where everybody's most excited, and even Thursday evening meal, and then it goes downhill really, 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 really quickly.
Right.
And so, kind of the stunned nature of the disciples. I think one of the most interesting things you see is the variety of responses of Jesus's closest followers, where you have some who deny, some who stay and try to take care of the body. You have some that go fishing. You have some that disappear for a week, like Thomas. You just get a variety of different responses, and I think that really kind of exemplifies in a church, for instance, if there's a trauma event that impacts a church, you can have as many different responses as you have people in the congregation. There can just be wide variety and wide array.
And those you mentioned, Jesus responded to each one of those differently.
He did, yeah.
He didn't throw out pat answers for them all.
No, no.
That's good.
And I'm even kind of fascinated with Thomas. Jesus could have appeared, Thomas is not there the first day, then a week later, Thomas is there. Jesus could have appeared to him at any point during the week, but he lets him struggle, and then shows up and kind of addresses his specific struggle. And I think that's fascinating. He doesn't, do some kind of magic type of thing for Thomas's sake. There are 7 days of real struggle, and I think that's kind of amazing. I do think you see when Mary is there and she sees Jesus and she doesn't even recognize him. Again, that makes sense in terms of trauma fog. You go and you think you're going to anoint the body, and there's this terrible thing that's happened. Your mind can't even make sense out of it, and you just can't process what's going on. And even though Jesus is talking to her, it takes a moment until he calls her name, and she comes out of her trauma fog and grabs him, and it's kind of an amazing story, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of trauma. One other, the chapter on grief. One of the things that I mentioned is, does Jesus grieve? And I think there are a couple of instances. For me, one of them in John 11, when Lazarus is in the tomb, right before he raises Lazarus, we know that Jesus wept. And, whether he's grieving or not, I think he is noticing how much people are hurting in their grief, and he cares about it. And so I think there's a real kind, even though he knows he's about to raise him, I think he sees the brokenheartedness, especially of his sisters, and I think his grief is in resonance with what's going on for them. But when his followers come and tell him that his cousin John has been killed, it says Jesus went away by himself, up into the mountains, went away by himself. I think he went away to grieve.
Yeah.
Folks come and find him, and he responds and ministers when they find him. But I think he's up there grieving the loss of his cousin. And I think it was a pretty beloved cousin. Wow. But I think he's probably grieving at that moment. So we do in the New Testament, there are some interesting examples of these things that we're talking about.
Good. Well, let me ask you, we don't have much time left. Carl wanted to know, are there red flags you'd suggest looking for when we as pastors immediately point to professional counseling? Let me read it again. Are there red flags you'd suggest looking for where we as pastors should immediately point to professional counseling?
Okay, yeah, and I think it's a really good question. Some ministers are really good at counseling, and sort of intuitively by their gifts, they do good counseling. Others don't, I think recognizing if you're one that does or one that doesn't, if it just isn't one of the things that you've been gifted with, or if you're really uncomfortable with it, I would do more of what I talked about, trying to connect with trusted counselors in your area, your church, or your surrounding area. Um, um, there are times where you can meet with a person and meet with them again, and it feels like they're getting worse. You need to be aware of that. Um, uh, uh, Even people who have been committed believers can struggle with thoughts of self harm right after a traumatic event. And I always assess for self harm. And so, if that's not something you're familiar with or comfortable with, if you have any indication that a person is struggling with that, then you really probably do want to get them with a person who can make a more detailed evaluation about a person's safety level. And so that would be something that I would watch for. Um, if people commonly after trauma um, will do things to distract or numb the pain. And so you do see alcohol or drugs or pornography or gambling or spending money, and all the kind of addictive processes are not unusual for a person to kind of engage with. And so if I'm seeing something like drugs or alcohol, and it's not something I've dealt with much, I would really want someone to be watching with them, because trauma, and if a person's having self harm thoughts, and if you mix in drugs or alcohol, things could go in a bad direction pretty quickly. And so that would be another red flag. Um, those would be at least a few that would come to mind.
That's good. Got about 3 more minutes here. So the Jim spelled out the acronym for us, a National Child Trauma Stress Network. I know our chaplaincy center here is helping sponsor a webinar on this topic. So are you familiar with the National Trauma Stress Network?
I do not know that one. The one for children that I'm the most familiar with and have interacted with the most would be childtrauma.org out of Houston. It's Dr. Bruce Perry. He's a medical doctor and a licensed psychologist, and they do some really, really, really good stuff. There are other organizations of that nature, and that well could be one of those that does some really good things too.
Okay.
But I apologize that I can't speak to that particular one or their approach. There's another approach you see, TBRI, trauma-based relational, and it's based. It actually was started by a therapist in Fort Worth, and you see that a lot with adopted children and foster children. And it's a TBRI framework that's used, and that's another one that seems to be a really good, solid framework out there.
Terrific. Well, Scott, I want to say thank you. But before we sign off, I want to remind everybody that if you will post this live stream on Facebook, your name will go into a drawing for a 1-year subscription to Seminary Now. And I promise you, if you've not been to seminarynow.com and looked through the library, you will want to do that. You'll want to pay the subscription, in my opinion. But also, if you want to sign up to view Scott's course and you want some of the details, there's 13 lessons in this section. There's a workbook that goes with it. You can sign up for Seminary Now for a 7-day free trial. So I recommend that to you. So
and let me jump in and say one more thing
sure.
too. I don't have on my screen. I can't see who's there. Any of you that are participating, if you want to email me for any reason, feel free to do that. And you could reach me through BH Carroll, or it is sfloyd@bhcarroll.edu. And so if there's a question we didn't answer, if there's something you'd like to dialogue, or if you just had thoughts or observations about things I've said, feel free to email me, and I'll correspond with you about the things we talked about. And let me encourage you too, the training for you individually, or those of you that do it in your churches. I think it could be a great thing to help prepare your church for these kinds of events that could take place.
Right. And Scott, what you just said is an example of why I'm pleased to be part of BH Carroll. There is more than just the transfer of information. There's a desire to come alongside of your experience and wealth of knowledge, and your spiritual depth, all of those things you make available to those who need and want it. And I appreciate that about you. And also, I know our counseling program has some what we call brown bags that you can get continuing education units by attending, but also, again, just good practical help. I remember attending one that had to do with self-harm and suicide that was so helpful to me personally, as a volunteer chaplain and as a minister. So I'm grateful to what you're doing. And sometimes when we think theology, we don't think counseling, but counseling is very much a part of walking alongside, equipping people, healing, being part of God's healing process in their lives. And so grateful for you and all the counselors, chaplains, pastors who walk alongside folks and who face grief and loss and trauma and crises day after day after day. God uses you in mighty ways, and I appreciate it deeply.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Seminary Now again for hosting this event and allowing us to do this.
And for you who are viewing, thank you so much. And again, don't forget about the free subscription and the 7-day trial to be part of this. Thank you so much, and God bless you as you serve Him and His mission in your life.